I want you to put yourself in a specific headspace for a second. Imagine it's the year 100 AD. You're in Rome, the absolute peak of ancient civilization. Paved roads, aqueducts, massive temples. But you feel terrible. You're burning up with a fever, or maybe you have a deep infection in your leg that's turning black. You are undeniably sick. So, looking at all the resources available in the greatest city on Earth, where do you go?
Well, if you're looking for a building with doctors, beds, and nurses, a hospital, the answer is terrifyingly simple. Nowhere. You go nowhere.
It's such a strange concept to wrap your head around, because today the hospital is just the anchor of our healthcare system. It's the first place you think of.
It is.
But based on the history we're looking at today, if you were an average person in the ancient world, there was literally no institution designed to take you in and make you better.
That's exactly right. The hospital isn't a default setting of human civilization. It didn't exist in ancient Babylon or Egypt or Greece or, Rome. If you were sick and didn't have money, you suffered at home. And if you didn't have a home, you suffered in the street.
Which brings us to the core of what we're digging into today. We are looking at the origin story of the hospital. And what struck me in the research is that this wasn't an invention of medical science. It wasn't a discovery like penicillin or germ theory.
No, not at all. It was a social invention. It was a radical restructuring of how society views the vulnerable.
And it traces back to one specific moment, a famine in the 4th century, and one specific guy, Basil of Caesarea.
Basil the Great. He's the architect of what gets called the New City, or the Basiliad. He essentially took medicine, which up until that point was a luxury good for the wealthy, and he transformed it into a public utility for the poor.
Okay, so before we get to Basil and this new city, we have to understand the landscape he was disrupting. Because when we say no hospitals in Rome, I think a lot of people might point to the valetudinaria. I was reading about these. They were infirmaries, right? They had beds, they had surgeons. That sounds like a hospital.
It does. It looks like one on the surface, but the function was completely different. The valetudinaria were strictly for two groups of people: professional soldiers and slaves.
So not the general public.
Strictly private. And if you look at the motivation behind them, it wasn't charity, it wasn't about care, really. It was asset management.
Asset management.
A slave owner in Rome viewed a slave as a financial investment. If that slave is sick, you're losing productivity. So you send them to the infirmary to get patched up so they can get back to work.
It's like taking your car to the mechanic. You don't do it because you love the car's feelings. You do it because you need to drive to work.
Precisely. And the same logic applied to the legions. The empire needs soldiers on the frontier not dying of dysentery. So the state provided medical care to keep the military machine running. But if you were a free citizen who happened to be poor, a day laborer, a widow, a peasant, you had no economic value to a master or the state. You were excluded.
That is just a grim calculation.
Yeah.
It implies that in the pre-Christian Roman world, healthcare was explicitly tied to your utility. If you weren't useful, you weren't treated.
That was the prevailing ethos. The ideal man in antiquity was healthy, strong, productive. Illness, especially chronic illness or poverty, was often seen as a character flaw or a curse. There was no sense of societal obligation to care for a stranger.
What about the religious angle? The sources mention the temples of Asclepius. I know people went there for healing. I've seen the ruins where they had the stoa for people to sleep in.
They did, but we need to distinguish between medical care and magico-religious ritual. The Asclepians were sanctuaries. You would go there, pay a donation, and sleep in the holy precinct, hoping the god Asclepius would visit you in a dream and prescribe a cure.
So the priests weren't setting bones or stitching wounds.
Generally, no. They were dream interpreters. And there were strict gatekeepers, as you noted. You had to pay. But more importantly, the temples had strict purity laws. Birth and death were considered ritual impurities. Yeah. So if you were a woman in labor, or if you were terminally ill and close to death, you were barred from entry.
Wait, that is a massive contradiction. The people who need help the most, the dying, are the ones who get kicked out.
Because they would pollute the shrine. So you have the situation where the rich have private doctors making house calls, concierge medicine, essentially. The soldiers and slaves have maintenance bays. And the superstitious have temples that reject the dying. But for the vast majority of the population, there is simply a void.
And that void is where Basil steps in. Now, reading his biography, he doesn't seem like the type of person who would be concerned with the poor. He was born around 330 AD into the 1%, right?
Oh, absolutely. He was from Cappadocian nobility, that's modern-day Turkey. His family owned massive estates. He was incredibly well-connected. He went to school in Athens, which was the intellectual capital of the world. He studied rhetoric, philosophy, astronomy, all alongside the future Emperor Julian.
And he studied medicine.
He did. And that's a crucial detail. He wasn't just a theologian. He understood the best medical science of his day. He knew about Galen and Hippocrates.
So he comes back from Athens, brilliant and wealthy, but then the timeline hits 369 AD, the Great Famine. The descriptions of this in the source material are just horrific.
It was a catastrophe. A drought destroyed the harvest in Cappadocia, and in the ancient economy, when supply drops, prices skyrocket. But it wasn't just nature at work. Basil observed that the wealthy landowners, his peers, were holding back grain. They were hoarding it in storehouses, waiting for the prices to peak so they could maximize their profit.
Well, people were literally starving in the streets outside those same storehouses.
Exactly. And Basil wrote these searing sermons during this time. He talks about the rich man who acts like he doesn't know the needy while his granaries are bursting. Basil essentially breaks rank with his own class. He starts liquidating his inheritance to fund soup kitchens.
But soup kitchens are a temporary fix. You feed people during the crisis, and then when the food runs out, the problem is still there. The sources say this is where he pivoted from emergency aid to systemic change.
That's the key. Basil realized that the famine had caused a secondary crisis. Malnutrition led to disease outbreaks. People's immune systems had collapsed. He saw that just handing out bread wasn't enough. He needed a permanent structure to care for the bodies of the vulnerable.
And this wasn't just, a nice idea he had. It seems rooted in a completely different way of seeing humans compared to that Roman view of utility.
It's the theological pivot. The Roman view asked, is this person useful? Basil's view, rooted in his faith, asked, is this person a bearer of the imago Dei, the image of God? He believed that every human being, the leper, the starving peasant, the outcast, had infinite inherent dignity because they were created by God.
So caring for them wasn't asset management anymore. It was a moral imperative.
It was an act of worship. And he had a legal hook, too. The Council of Nicaea, the big church council from 325 AD, had passed these things called the Arabic canons. And Canon 75 actually mandated that every cathedral city had to establish a place for the poor and sick. It was a law in the books, but nobody had really built one on a large scale yet. Basil decided to do it.
And he didn't go small. He built the Basiliad.
The new city.
Let's walk through this complex because calling it a hospital almost sells it short. It was massive. It was built just outside the walls of Caesarea.
It was a city within a city. Gregory of Nazianzus, who was Basil's best friend, wrote about it with total awe. It wasn't just one big hall, it was a complex of buildings centered around a magnificent church. You had housing for the medical staff, doctors and nurses lived on site. You had a pharmacy, a dispensary. You had separate wards for different diseases to prevent cross-contamination.
Which is a surprisingly advanced medical concept for the 4th century.
It is. It shows his medical training. He understood that you don't put the patient with a fever next to the patient with a broken leg.
One of the features that surprised me the most was the industrial school. You don't usually see trade schools inside hospitals.
This is where Basil's genius really shines. He understood that health isn't just biological, it's economic. If you heal a poor person and send them back to the street with no skills, they're just going to starve again. The Basiliad included workshops to teach orphans and the poor trades, shoemaking, weaving, metalwork.
So it was rehabilitation.
It was total rehabilitation. He was trying to restore their agency, not just their health. It breaks that cycle of dependency.
There's another specific ward that we have to talk about because it seems to be the most radical part of the whole project. The leper colony.
The leprosarium. To understand this, you have to realize that leprosy was the ultimate stigma. It was visible, disfiguring, and terrifying to the ancient world. Lepers were legally dead. They were driven out of cities, often forced to wear bells to warn people they were coming. They were living corpses.
And Basil invites them in.
He builds a specific facility for them right at the heart of the complex. But he goes further than just building walls. The historical accounts tell us that Basil, a bishop, a nobleman, a man of high status, personally attended to the lepers. He bandaged their wounds. He embraced them.
That physical touch seems like the important part there.
It shattered the stigma. In a world where people threw rocks at lepers to keep them away, the leader of the community hugging them sent a shockwave through society. It signaled that these people were still part of the human family.
Now, building a city-sized medical complex isn't cheap. We know he used his own inheritance, but that has to run out. How did he sustain this?
He was a relentless fundraiser. He used his rhetoric to persuade the wealthy families of Cappadocia that their salvation was tied to their generosity. He essentially argued that they were merely stewards of God's money, and the Basiliad was the treasury where they should deposit it.
And he even got the emperor involved, which is bizarre because Emperor Valens and Basil were effectively enemies, right?
They were theological adversaries. Valens was an Arian, which was the dominant heresy at the time, denying the full divinity of Christ, and Basil was the staunch defender of Nicene orthodoxy. Valens actually came to Caesarea to threaten Basil, maybe even to banish him.
So how do you go from, I'm going to banish you, to, here's a donation for your hospital?
Valens was stunned by the Basiliad. He saw the sheer scale of the charity, the efficiency of the operation, and the fact that Basil was serving everyone regardless of their politics or creed. It was just undeniable competence. Valens ended up donating imperial lands to the hospital because, despite their differences, he couldn't argue with the results.
That's a powerful lesson. Competence and genuine service can bridge even the widest ideological gaps.
Absolutely.
So when we look at the Basiliad, historians call this the first true hospital. I want to drill down on that definition. Why doesn't the military infirmary count? Why is this the prototype?
It comes down to a specific trifecta. To be a true hospital in the modern sense, you need three things combined. 1, inpatient care, you stay there. 2, professional medicine doctors, nurses, science. And 3, charity. It has to be open to the public regardless of their ability to pay.
And the Basiliad was the first time those three overlapped.
Exactly. The valetudinaria had the first two, but lacked charity. The temples had a form of charity, but lacked professional medicine. Basil merged them. He married the scientific method of Greek medicine with the moral imperative of the Christian faith.
That marriage of science and faith is interesting because so often we're told those two are in conflict. But Basil didn't see it that way.
Not at all. Basil wrote that medicine was a gift from God. He believed God created herbs and roots for healing and gave humans the intellect to understand anatomy. So to reject medicine would be to reject God's provision. The doctors at the Basiliad were professionals. They were using the best science available, but doing it in a context of prayer and service.
So it wasn't pray or take medicine, it was take medicine as an act of prayer.
Precisely. And this model just exploded. It wasn't a one-off experiment that died with Basil. It became the standard for the Byzantine Empire. Within a few decades, you have St. Ephrem building a 300-bed hospital in Edessa. St. Samson builds one in Constantinople.
And it changed the definition of a city.
It did. Before Basil, a city was defined by its market, its theater, its defenses. After Basil, the cathedral city concept emerged, where a city wasn't complete unless it had a bishop and a hospital. The care of the poor became a civic duty.
It's amazing to think about the ripple effect. That influence didn't just stop at the Byzantine borders.
No, it went global. This model heavily influenced the Islamic Golden Age. The great hospitals of Baghdad and Cairo in the 9th and 10th centuries, which were incredibly advanced, can trace their lineage back to this concept of public, charitable medical care. And in the West, it evolved into the monastic infirmaries that eventually became the great hospitals of Europe.
So every time we drive past a massive medical center today, whether it's a university hospital or a religious one, we were looking at the legacy of that famine in 369 AD.
We are. We're living in Basil's shadow.
It brings up a question about what we've kept and what we've lost. We definitely kept the professionalism. We kept the inpatient care. We've scaled the science up 1,000,000 times over. But have we kept the spirit of the Basiliad?
That's the haunting question, isn't it? I want to leave you with a thought on the word itself. Hospital. It shares the same root as hospitality and host and hotel.
They all come from the Latin hospes, right? Meaning stranger or guest.
Yes. But in the ancient world, and in Basil's view, hospitality wasn't just having your friends over for dinner. It was a radical openness to the stranger, the person who has nothing to offer you, the person who might even be dangerous or repulsive to society.
The other.
Basil's new city was built on that radical hospitality. It was the place where the disaster of the poor was treated as a personal disaster for the community. Today, our hospitals are miracles of efficiency and technology. They are sterile, specialized, and often very corporate.
Asset management tends to creep back in.
It does. We worry about insurance codes, bed turnover rates, and profit margins, and those things are realities of the modern world. But the challenge Basil leaves us with is this. In our quest for medical efficiency, have we lost the soul of the hospital? Have we forgotten that its primary purpose isn't just to fix a broken biological machine, but to offer hospitality to a human being who is suffering?
It's the difference between curing a disease and caring for a person.
Exactly. Basil did both, and that's why 1700 years later, we're still talking about him.
It's a lot to think about the next time you walk through those automatic sliding doors. You're entering a space that was carved out of history by a refusal to look away.